All right, let's get started. I hope you can all hear me well. If not, please let us know through the chat. And otherwise, welcome everyone to this joint webinar on the Guidebook for monitoring and evaluating ecosystem-based adaptation interventions. My name is Luise Richter, and I am working for the BMU ICI-funded global project on mainstreaming EBA, which is implemented by GIZ. I will be your facilitator for this webinar, but as mentioned before, this is a joint webinar by GIZ, the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Center, and the Friends of EBA Network. It is great to have all of you here, and we all look forward to interesting inputs and lively discussions during this upcoming hour. I can see there are still more people joining. That's really great to see that there's so much interest in this topic. Yes, the webinar will be recorded. I can just see that question coming up in the chat. That's actually a really good bridge for me because before we dive into the topic, I would like to make some technical remarks. This webinar will be recorded and published on adaptationcommunity.net after the webinar. So for those who would not like to be recorded, I would kindly ask you to leave the webinar now. The webinar will be available for you to watch afterwards on adaptationcommunity.net, and then you can just check it out once we're done, and you won't be recorded as part of this webinar. I can still hear some background noises, so we would kindly ask all of you to mute yourselves and to turn your videos off for the duration of the webinar, except for, of course, if you're a speaker or a presenter. However, even though you might be muted and won't have a video on, this does not mean that you cannot actively contribute to this webinar. We would kindly ask you to use the MS Teams chat for comments and questions. And we will get back to these after our two inputs. So we will have a joint Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. We have a little survey that we invite you to participate in, and we'll post the link to the survey in the chat later on, and really look forward to your input there. Again, mute yourself. Oh, it's great to see many different countries joining here. Really great. But yes, please mute yourselves. The quality will be much better for everyone. If you have technical problems, please let us know via the chat or via email, and we will then do our best to help you. With this, let's return to what this webinar is actually about, which is the new guidebook for monitoring and evaluating ecosystem-based adaptation. The link yet. The M&E Guidebook has been published by the GIZ implemented global project Mainstreaming EBA, but it has been developed by UNEP-WCMC as part of a FEBA working group on monitoring and evaluation. So we have Emily Goodwin with us, who is a program officer at IUCN and a central figure to the FEBA Secretariat. Emily, I would like to briefly hand over to you. Could you maybe tell us a bit about what FEBA is and which role the working groups play within FEBA? Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can. Okay,
perfect. Thank you, Louise. So as Louise shared, the Monitoring and Evaluation Guidebook was developed in consultation with the FEBA Working Group on M&E for EBA. For those of you who are not familiar with FEBA, FEBA is a collaborative informal network of more than 80 organizations and 200 individuals and practitioners in EBA, working jointly to share their experiences and knowledge, to improve the implementation of EBA activities on the ground, and to have a collective, stronger and more strategic learning and policy influence on EBA. FEBA partners work to synthesize multi-stakeholder knowledge on EBA, disseminate this knowledge by convening the global EBA community around high-level events, technical workshops, and expert working groups, and raise awareness of an understanding of EBA and adaptation planning processes and multilateral policy frameworks, including the UNEP-WCMC and the CBD. And one of the key structures of FEBA for accomplishing this catalytic collaborative impact is that FEBA has several active expert working groups focused on different thematic areas in EBA, where we work on tackling key barriers and knowledge gaps as identified by the network. This was the origin of the working group on monitoring and evaluation, as structuring strong monitoring and evaluation frameworks was consistently identified across FEBA partners is a challenge in both measuring and communicating the effectiveness of EBA initiatives. So we look forward to staying engaged and continuing to collaborate around this M&E guidebook and mainstreaming the guidance here across the adaptation community. For those of you who are interested, we also have additional working groups focused on urban EBA, EBA in post-disaster and humanitarian context, and guidance for integrating EBA into national adaptation plans. If you're interested in joining FEBA, please reach out to me via email after the webinar for information on how to get involved. And I'll share my email in the chat box now for those of you who may not have it. Thank you, Louise.
Thanks a lot, Emily. And with that, let's now move on to the agenda for today. First, we have Sylvia Wicander from UNEP-WCMC, who will introduce us to the new guidebook. I can hear myself. I would kindly ask everyone to mute yourselves. Thank you very much. Yes, Sylvia will give us an overview of the main features of the guidebook, and she will also share how you can use the guidebook in your everyday work. After Sylvia's presentation, Lisa Hunsinger from GIZ Thailand will give us insights into the development of a community and digital solutions-based M&E methodology in Thailand. This example is also included in the guidebook already, but Lisa will also share some updates on the development process of the methodology. So we also have some new stuff in here that you cannot find in the guidebook. We will then move on to a short survey and dive into your questions and comments after both presentations. So with this, I would like to hand over to Sylvia and ask you to unmute yourself and turn on your camera. A very warm welcome to you, Sylvia. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Louisa. I hope everyone can hear and see me. And just another quick reminder, in case you haven't muted yourself, it would be great if you could mute yourself to reduce any background noise. I'm delighted to see so many people on this webinar today. And I'm just trying to share my screen here. Louisa, can you let me know if my screen is visible?
Yes, it's working.
Excellent. It's my first time engaging in MS Teams. So, like I said, it's a pleasure to see so many of you joining the webinar today, and which reflects an interest in monitoring and evaluation, which is thrilling for someone who's into the topic and knows it's important, although many people, kind of throw it by the side sometimes. As Louisa mentioned, we at UNEP-WCMC produced the guidebook for monitoring and evaluating EBA interventions with FEBA and the GIZ team. And my aim today really is to provide you with a brief overview of the guidebook, just really to get you acquainted with its content and hopefully to entice you to take a closer look as well. And so just before getting into the nitty-gritty of it, I wanted to take a step back to talk a little bit about why in the first place we decided to develop a guidebook on M&E for EBA. So as many of you in this group, I'm sure, are very well aware, we're unfortunately in the situation where we absolutely need to adapt to many negative climate change impacts. And EBA is a really important approach in the toolbox for doing so. But unfortunately, there are quite a few uncertainties associated with designing and implementing EBA linked to climatic and socioeconomic complexity. However, we do fortunately have a a handy tool that can help us deal with the uncertainty. So monitoring and evaluation, or I'm just going to refer to it as M&E from here on, provides the foundation for adaptive management, which is really the key to managing uncertainty. So we really need M&E for understanding whether or not and why an intervention is achieving its objectives. Now, I know that M&E for adaptation is particularly tricky, and even more so for EBA, because it involves a whole other set of social ecological consideration. And because it can be quite challenging to do M&E for EBA, and there's sort of a lot of demand and need for it, and lots of different sort of tools and materials, but not really quite enough to make sense of the whole thing. And a whole lot of other restrictions, often related to timelines and budgets and, you know, your other project responsibilities. So in that context, M&E often gets neglected. And we were hearing this message a lot through the FEBA working group, through various EBA community of practice events, and sort of in the wider EBA community. And I myself have been involved in quite a few projects in which we've reviewed EBA portfolios and done research on effectiveness of EBA. And it really it becomes clear over and over again that M&E, meaningful M&E, what I'll call it for now, is just often not a part of EBA projects, and which comes with a whole set of sort of knock-on effects that aren't particularly great. So in response to that, we basically, you know, we listened to you, we had conversations with you, and in response, we basically produced this guidebook. So we really hope that the guidebook will be a useful and helpful tool for you. So now getting to what you're all here to hear about. So what does this guidebook do? In very broad brushstrokes, it provides an overview of the process for designing and implementing effective M&E for EBA interventions on the ground. And it also kind of explains the intricacies and challenges associated with monitoring and evaluating EBA. And throughout the guidebook, really, you'll see that there's a strong emphasis on evaluating outcomes and impact. So it's really about how can we get to understanding the results of EBA interventions, not just looking at inputs and outputs, which of course are also important, but if we are truly to understand whether or not we're helping people adapt to climate change through using nature and ecosystems, we need to look beyond the outputs and inputs of a project. So with this in mind, we developed the guidebook primarily for practitioners and planners who design and implement EBA on the ground. But of course, it can be a useful resource to really anyone interested in assessing and understanding results of EBA interventions. And we ideally recommend to consult the guidebook in the early stages of designing an EBA intervention, because this will influence the intervention logic, which is very important. And but really, the guidebook can be useful to assist interventions that are already underway. So, for example, if you're already, somewhere along the way in your project, you can use the guidebook to help improve your original logical framework or the first M&E processes you set up at the start of the project. It can also really help in thinking about midterm reviews or final evaluations. And so basically the message is, it's rarely too late to use this guidebook and infuse your project with thinking that you can gain from this guidebook. And so a little bit about the structure of the guidebook. It opens with some background information on key terms and concepts for understanding EBA and M&E, because everyone, will come at this guidebook with a different background and different levels of understanding. So kind of to establish some common ground. And then it also goes into some detail on the complexities and challenges associated with M&E of EBA, but also wider adaptation interventions. And as I've mentioned before, it's not the most straightforward process that will be part of your project, but understanding the challenges associated with M&E and EBA is basically half the battle won, because once you have that awareness, you'll be able to integrate risks and assumptions into your planning. And then the rest of the guidebook is dedicated to 4 steps for designing M&E for EBA, starting with developing a results framework and defining indicators and setting the baseline, and then focusing on how to operationalize all of the more conceptual work in an M&E system. So step 3 is kind of gets into some nuts and bolts and practicality. And step 4 of the guidebook goes into the issue of communicating and using the results that you're going to do with all the data that you've collected. And there's some features of each section that I wanted to highlight that we hope will make the user experience of the guidebook easier. So one is that every section starts with a short summary of the section, so you can get a snapshot of what's going on. I just want to highlight also that we've written the guidebook in hopefully very simple and easy to understand, sort of clear language, and to use diverse kind of design tools to help you use the guidebook and go between sections and so on. And each section also has additional useful resources. So if you think of the guidebook as a sort of overarching source of guidance, but each section in this additional resources bit has other more detailed guidance that will pick up on various aspects that we've highlighted in our guidebook. So that look at that section to see if there is more detailed guidance on specific aspects already available. A lot of times we don't need to reinvent the wheel on tools and methods. A lot of stuff is already out there. And we've also included a lot of case studies that reflect certain aspects of robust M&E systems. And these are taken from different countries around the world. So they kind of bring to life some of the aspects that we're highlighting in the guidebook, and will hopefully be useful and a nice source of inspiration for the reader. There are also a number of practical annexes at the end that further elaborate on some of the points made earlier in the guidebook and give you a couple of tips for practice. So taking a slightly closer look at the 4 steps, I say slightly because we don't have time to go in depth in this webinar. And before I do so, I just wanted you to remember that in the context of this guidebook, there's really no one-size-fits-all approach for monitoring and evaluating EBA. Every situation is different and will need to be tailored and then treated in context. So the 4 steps from the guidebook are broad ones that pretty much any project team working on an EBA intervention should be able to follow. And they can use the steps as the basis for designing and implementing a robust M&E system. And leading you straight into step 1, as I mentioned earlier, it starts with a focus on developing results framework. So it discusses the need for setting clear objectives and mapping the pathway for achieving the objectives. And it explains how results frameworks can assist you in doing so, and outlines a few different types of results frameworks. However, the guidebook really recommends using a theory of change approach for EBA interventions, there's a growing consensus in the adaptation community, especially the part of the climate change adaptation community dealing with monitoring and evaluation, that a theory of change approach is the most suitable in this context, because it's good for complex and long-term projects, or interventions, which is obviously the case for climate change adaptation more broadly, and in particular for ecosystem-based adaptation. So then the guidebook continues in step 1 to expand on when and broadly how to use the theory of change approach, a couple of potential limitations to keep in mind, and also what a fully worked out theory of change could look like in an EBA context. And then in step 2, the guidebook goes into some details related to defining indicators, baselines, and targets. It introduces various types of indicators available for M&E, highlights importance of focusing on outcomes and impact indicators in order to understand effectiveness of EBA measures. So again, you will have some input, process, and output indicators in your M&E system, but this guidebook is really saying, challenge yourself to think about how to understand outcome and impact. And in step 2, you'll also get some general guidance for selecting the best indicators. The guidebook doesn't give you sort of a list of the one and only kind of indicator or set of indicators for EBA, because projects are so context specific, and but it does provide guidance on the types of indicators you should be thinking of looking into. And step 2 also highlights the importance of setting a baseline and identifying targets to make those indicators meaningful. And then step 3, like I said, it's really about the practicalities of an M&E system, so how to operationalize it, including choosing the right evaluation design, thinking about data considerations. So there are lots of different types of data, what is most suitable in the context of your EBA intervention. And step 3 also goes into elements of effective and efficient data collection, entry, analysis, and interpretation, all of which are really important processes that will allow you to make use of all of the effort you've put into the kind of more conceptual parts of designing a theory of change and indicators. And then lastly, in step 4, the discussion really focuses on the need to use M&E results both to inform adaptive management. I mean, that is kind of the fundamental aim of M&E, but also to communicate results to external audiences, to your project. So, I mean, and you'll be working with internal project stakeholders, local communities, and so on and so forth to work together on the adaptive management processes. But it's really important to also think of external audiences, such as donors, communities, policymakers, and the wider adaptation community. And the guidebook gives recommendations on basically points and issues that are useful to highlight to those various audiences. And so that was kind of my whistle-stop tour of the M&E guidebook, and I really hope that it has given you a flavor for what's in there. And I invite you to download a copy of the guidebook if you haven't already done so. It's available under the resources section on adaptationcommunity.net. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I'm going to hand on to the next presenter. So I'd ask Lisa to unmute yourself and turn on your camera and give us a little flavor from what you're working on in Thailand on M&E. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you.
So give me a second, I'm just getting myself sorted out. So thank you, Sylvia. Thank you for sharing these interesting points about the M&E Guidebook, which we in Thailand are also using. Unfortunately, my camera doesn't seem to be working, but you can see my full screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. The first slide, right?
Yes, now it's the first slide.
Okay, great. Okay, so hello everybody. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to speak and to share with you what we're doing in Thailand, where we are developing a framework for the M&E of EBA in the water sector. We are doing this together with our partner, the Office of National Water Resources, the lead agency in Thailand for water, and 5 Thai universities. Okay. So in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll give you a very brief background on the program and context under which we're working on the M&E of EBA, before I then go over to tell you a little bit about the approach we're taking and the elements we want to include in the framework. And finally, I'll give you a short outlook on some of the challenge and opportunities that might lie ahead. Sorry, I'm not handling this too well yet. Okay. So today I'm speaking on behalf of a BMU-funded ICI project, the Thai-German Climate Program, TGCP. The TGCP works across 5 components, of which one is water. So we call this TGCP Water. And our focus is to support the integration of climate change adaptation and EBA into national policies and into key planning processes in Thailand's 22 river basins. We work across 5 fields of actions, with M&E being one of these. So this is also where the M&E of EBA and the common issue of the lack of evidence of the benefits of EBA come into play. So to generate some more evidence for the Thai context, we have established what we call the Joint Research Partnership that is made up by the UNEP-WR in the lead, 5 Thai universities, and GIZ. As a first step, we are financing 2 pilot projects that will develop an M&E framework for water-related EBA solutions. And the projects will be carried out by a team of 3 universities each, looking at different types of EBA to start with, and then merging the results of each, let's say, EBA methodology or EBA M&E methodology, hopefully into one methodology or framework, which then should be applicable for a range of EBA types in the end. So you might have already kind of heard, we are currently waiting to finalize the contracts with the universities for the pilot project. So they haven't officially started yet, but we hope that we can get started very soon. So what is the general approach we are taking? The idea is ultimately to develop an M&E framework that covers different kinds of EBA measures in the water sector, and that is based on 3 pillars. The first pillar, as I already mentioned just now, is refers to the methodological part. The idea is that the university teams will develop a draft methodology each and then try to merge these, I call them prototypes, I'm not sure if that's the right word, into a single or kind of umbrella methodology. The second pillar is about community involvement. Here the universities will look into options to engage local stakeholders in the data collection and monitoring in the long term. So we would like to also see a community-based approach to the M&E framework. And the third pillar is the use of digital solutions, not only for gathering data in the beginning mostly, of course, but also for continued and longer term M&E. And the first thing that comes to mind are UAVs, I guess. But apart from these kind of, at least for me, high-tech solutions like drones, we are also thinking about trying to include more simple digital-based solutions, which could be mobile applications or any other ideas that come from citizen science. So, as I already said, the teams will look at different types of EBA solutions, and they will test the methodologies that they develop in 2 pilot sites each. So if we have a short look at the pilot sites, the EBA solution that the first team will be working on are flood detention areas. Both of the pilot sites are located in the lower part of northern Thailand, in an area that is dominated by agriculture, but that is also periodically flooded. And the flood water there lingers in the area for about 110 to 120 days on average. So if my maths are correct, that's about 3 to 4 months per year. So for each EBA solution, we asked the university to pick 2 examples with a slight variation. So in this case, we have as a first pilot site a natural wetland that can function as a floodplain, and as a second pilot site, an area that is used for agricultural purposes in the dry season, and while it is flooded in the rainy season, so it is used as floodwater storage. It's also the area that you can see on the picture. And that is actually a quite interesting model that has gained some prominence in Thailand. It is called the Bangwa Kam model, because the farmers that farm the land in the dry season, in exchange for allowing their land to be flooded in the rainy season, they receive additional water diverted from the neighboring river basin in the dry season to start their crop cycle earlier. Sorry for jumping between the seasons so much. And in addition, in the wet season, so when everything is flooded, they also get some support. So they are able to take up some fishing and aquaculture activities and other economic activities related to that. The second EVA measure that will be analyzed are so-called living weirs. This seems to be a term that was coined in Thailand, if I understand correctly. It signifies a kind of a check dam for flood and drought risk management, and is made by bamboo construction, some sandbags filled with natural materials, and then especially by the roots of the banyan trees that are planted on either side of the riverbed. And the idea is they have typically very long roots, and so these roots are meant to kind of be carried by the bamboo construction, nurtured also by the contents of the sandbags, and then step by slowly eventually grow together to form this living weir. So that's where the term comes from. For the methodology development, the university team will look at a series of 6 living weirs located in the upstream to midstream of Klong La River in the south of Thailand. So not a huge, it's not a huge river, and also at a single living weir in the midstream of Wang He River, which is also a smaller stream in the south of Thailand. Then our work packages that I guess kind of I just noticed relate to what Sylvia was talking about, although we are a bit weak on the step 1 of the M&E guidebook. So that will definitely be a takeaway, one of the takeaways of today already. So process-wise, the idea is that in the first phase, the university develop a draft methodology by selecting indicators, targets, setting baselines, and so on, and do some first on-site assessments. And then in the next step, they would test the approach on the ground by going into the pilot sites, gather data, assess data sources, data gaps, and also start working with the communities. Based on the results of the testing, the draft methodology would then be revised, and the work with the other university team would be intensified to see how both approaches can be fitted into a single and hopefully flexible MLE framework. And then in the last step, there would of course be some finalizing, documenting, and then also handing over the results to ONWR. So nearly coming to an end, I have 2 final slides in which I thought about potential challenges and opportunities. Well, they're really based on my thoughts, can't speak for anyone else here. So as potential challenges for coming up with a robust EBA monitoring framework, I have listed the experience that with working on, for example, the theory of change, results-based frameworks, or impact-based M&E in the Thai context, because here, I guess that's the case in many countries, we are definitely used to see more of an output-oriented M&E where there is M&E in the first place. Then also the experience and the understanding of the EBA concept is still in its beginnings. Although nature-based solutions in water resources management are known and also used, as you can see in the Bangrakam model, but they so far also don't take climate change aspects into account. So that is also something very new in the water sector context here. Another factor might be the different scales of the EBA measures, as you heard. So we have very small scale living with and kind of large scale solutions of flood retention areas. And then I guess, that's a challenge in itself to actually draft, develop a M&E framework for EBA, and then we hope that sort of by doing this intermediate step of developing the prototypes and then merging into a single framework that will help. So on the positive note, as already mentioned, nature-based solutions in Thailand are already used, although they might not be perceived as such and definitely not labeled as EBA measures. But there is experience to use them, and there's also quite a lot of solid data available. Sorry, I forgot about my slides. So there will also be some synergies with other activities that we are undertaking in TGCP Water, so that we hope that we can link the EBA framework to planning processes, to the master plan process on the river basin level, and also integrate the approach into the framework for adaptation reporting under the Paris Agreement. And then we're also starting a capacity building program in which we will also incorporate the M&E of EBA for different stakeholders. And then luckily we are not the first ones or not the only ones working on M&E of EBA. So we're quite happy that the EBA M&E Guidebook is available. I think it's really an excellent framework to use. And as you said, Sylvia, I think it's also really written in a good and easy to understand language. So we've actually already sent this to the universities, but we really also want to use this as a framework to guide us through the work. There will be 2 working groups under the joint research partnership that we will discuss results with, and then we will also plan to get some external backstopping support. Then maybe last slide, beyond project implementation, I guess, so of course this list is not conclusive, but just to highlight a few aspects. So potential barriers for such an M&E framework to really be taken up and replicated could of course be related to the complexity of EBA and the complexity also in parts of M&E. But I think that just also points towards the importance of training our partners and those stakeholders that actually should use or will use the framework in the end. Then in terms of budget in the Thai system, there are certain requirements that make it hard for the water sector to apply for budget for nature-based solutions, especially since the results are long-term and come along with a certain level of uncertainty. So far it's not really possible to apply for budget if you cannot really point out the direct outputs and effects. And of course, there's also a certain risk that the framework might be too difficult, or it might be too difficult to really engage local communities in the long term, or that the incentives also might not be sufficient for them to be interested. On the other hand, I think there's a great chance that the work on the M&E of EBA raises the understanding of EBA itself, and also raises awareness, so not only on the benefits of EBA measures, but also on the benefits of having a monitoring system in place. And with some evidence from the Thai context, I think it will also become easier to make some leeway towards integrating EBA into the water sector budget, which of course, if we want to use EBA on a larger scale, is crucial. And ultimately, I think the M&E of EBA can also strengthen the inclusion of local stakeholders in water resources management. The Thai government is currently really trying to focus more on participatory approaches and the inclusion of local knowledge, which still I would say is also probably in its beginning, and depends a little bit on the river basins, how strong communities are. But a community-based M&E framework would, I think, be a very good example of how to empower communities and give them a stronger role, also with view to climate change adaptation on the local level. So having said that, I'm coming to an end. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to hear your questions or remarks or experiences. And if I have 1 minute left, Louisa, I'm happy to read out the quote that made me happy in the past days from the M&E Guidebook, which says, "Given the importance of M&E, it is better to set up an M&E system that has some limitations and shortcomings, to acknowledge them and to address these over time, rather than not engaging in any M&E activities at all." So I think that can give a positive vibe and positive outlook. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for this great quote at the end, and for your input. And thank you very much, Sylvia, also for sharing your insights. Now we will move on to questions and comments. I've already seen that there are quite a few in the chat, which is great. I think we can allow for going 5 minutes over time just to make sure that we actually can go to your questions. But before that, I would like to invite all of you to participate in a short survey. The link will be posted in the chat in a moment. Because, as mentioned before, an M&E working group exists within the FEBA network. And we all know that the topic of M&E is a tricky one for many people, and that we need to build up capacities and to collect experience to get a better a better set of implementation of M&E going. And therefore, we hope not to end with this webinar, but to build a community around this topic. We would like to stay in touch with you on your examples and experiences with Wendy, and we would also like to hear from you with what you've done and regarding your needs linked to monitoring and evaluation of EBA, so that we can respond to this maybe in a further series of webinars. So we would kindly ask you to take this survey by clicking the link in the chat that is now open on Mentimeter, either in that should then open in another window on your computer, or if you prefer to use your phone by going to menti.com and typing in the code 477501 now. That would be really great. And with that, I will hand over to Emily, who will show us quickly what the results are that are coming in right now. It looks good, Emily. I can see your screen.
Perfect. Thank you. So I've just posted the link in the chat, or as it shares on the screen, you can use your phone or whatever is most convenient to go to www.menti.com and type in this code to access this, and then we'll go through a couple of different questions here. If anyone is having any trouble accessing that, just give us a note in the chat and we can help you out. So we have about half of the participants who have been able to submit so far. So I'll leave it for another 20 or so seconds, and then we can move on to the next question. But it's interesting to see the results so far.
Certainly looks like there will be in a good audience for the M&E guidebook based on these first results in.
Yeah, agreed.
I wonder if we should maybe move on to the next question, Emily?
Sure. All right, thank you, everyone. So you'll stay on the same link to come in now for the next question. And I'll leave this one up for 30 or so seconds. So it's interesting that it seems prevalent right now that the development of indicators and indicators in the baselines is definitely coming across as sort of a core thing that is useful in the M&E guidebook for all of you.
Oh, the screen's really filling up now, isn't it?
All right, I'll give everyone about 10 more seconds for this before I move on to the next question. But this is really interesting. Thank you for your feedback here. Again, this lots about indicators, identifying indicators, following a theory of change for an M&E system, and communicating the results.
Yeah, this is all really valuable and will help us think about additional support we can provide.
All right, thank you, everyone. If you just have 1 or 2 seconds to wrap up, I'm going to move to the next question. All right, thank you, everyone. So this one is a ranking one. What would you like to receive further support on from this team? What would be useful for specific follow-up from us if there were further webinars, further guidance? What would you like to see more of?
I'm kind of wondering if, while people fill in the survey, we should get started on the Q&A so that we have a bit of time to actually dive into those as well, and then sort of like take a break in between and look at the results. Would that be okay? Awesome. Then let's start with a question to Sylvia. How can we differentiate an output from an outcome indicator? Because it is a little difficult to understand the example in the guidebook with output measures as hectares and outcome surface area.
Thanks for that. I'm glad someone looked at the guidebook in such a detailed way. So the main difference is an output is an immediate, let's say, product of what you have done. So this can be either so the activity, for example, would be running we can stick with the planting. So the activity could be basically you're planting mangrove seedlings, and the output is that you have planted X hectares of mangrove seedlings. But then the outcome is really looking at beyond what the immediate result of that activity is. So are your mangrove seedlings taking? Are they staying in place? Have they survived? Are they starting to show qualities, being able to build resilience? So you're thinking beyond the immediate, I think the immediate result of an activity to something that is slightly longer term that links to your ultimate aim. So you can break down the outcomes again into different stages or different timelines. Thinking of immediate outcomes and longer-term outcomes, because in the context of climate change adaptation, we're thinking very long-term. And I hope that is giving some clarity to it. I'd be happy to pick it up further, but it's basically thinking of what are the actual results of activities that also start linking back at least to your aims, which are linked to building climate change adaptation or resilience.
Okay, thank you very much, Sylvia. I would kindly like to ask you to be brief in your responses so that we can fit in a few more questions, but also to everyone who posted a question, I think we can get back to you on them. We're collecting them right now, so we can send you an email afterwards and also reply to them if we don't get around to all the questions. I would now have a question for Lisa. What are the indicators in your M&E framework that make it different from a purely technical M&E framework, meaning from one which monitors only whether living weirs stopped flooding or not?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. So, of course, we will have hydrological indicators, which is probably what you mean also about technical M&E framework. But we will also look at co-benefits in terms of biodiversities, how does the ecological environment, the ecosystem evolve or change over time, and then also look at socioeconomic indicators.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. Before we move on to the next question, Emily, do you quickly want to share what we're seeing here? Say a sentence on that.
Sure, absolutely. So referencing back to the previous slide, again, indicators, baselines, and targets was identified as the place where we could provide the most further support to those participating in the call. On the current slide that we're seeing right now, on examples, cases, and ongoing M&E efforts, I would encourage everyone who's saying, I would encourage the people sharing information here to send us an email. We'll have our emails up at the end of this, and Sylvia, Louisa, and I a note with more information, and we can talk further. But we are looking for examples and cases of ongoing M&E. Thank you. And then just as a quick note, I'm going to move to the last question here, but if you have further information on case studies, please share it with us. And the last question, this one, the results will be hidden. But please share any feedback here. It's totally anonymous if you have on the webinar about how useful it was, what we could have done differently, and anything that you'd like to see next time.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, let's move on to another question, and I'll just go ahead with one that I can answer myself, which is the question on whether or not the guidebook will be available in other languages. As of now, we only have it in English, but I can tell you that we're going to aim to make a Spanish version of it as well, so that it will be available in Spanish at some point. It might take some time until we get there, but that's what we're aiming for. So yeah, for now, English and then probably a Spanish version. And then moving on to another question to Sylvia. How do you measure the connection of different spatial scales in M&E for EBA?
How do you measure the connection between different spatial scales? Could you repeat it, please?
Yes, sure. How do you measure the connection of different spatial scales in M&E? If the person is still here, if the question is not clear.
I am going to interpret that as how do you potentially aggregate information from different spatial scales? So if I've understood the question correctly, you're talking about if you have multiple projects or multiple things going on at a site scale and you want to understand that at a landscape scale, in which case you would have to start with developing an overarching sort of M&E framework for the landscape in question, and you would have to be working with the various partners actually doing the work at the specific sites. And then you would want to have a set of core indicators that can be used at the landscape level that could have sort of, let's say, friendly attachment indicators at the site scale, because every site is likely to have its own set of indicators that are appropriate in that particular context, and site to site can vary a lot. But so what you would do is you would try to have some specific indicators as well as some core indicators that are consistent across the landscape. So then at a certain point you would be able to aggregate those and bring them together. But it's a very technical question, so I hope that'll do for now.
Thank you, Sylvia. For the person who posted the question, if it didn't really answer the question, please send another message in the chat and we can get back to you via email on this. Now another question for Lisa. Are the teams that are performing the M&E also part of or related to the teams that originally implemented the interventions? Yeah, I don't know how this links to, because you're still in a very early stage, how relevant this is as of now.
So our project itself is not implementing any EBA measures itself. We are working around, let's say, some EBA measures and promoting EBA, like, for example, with developing this M&E system. And no, the teams were not part of the implementation, or maybe partly. So if we talk about the living weirs, these are built by local communities, partly with some government support. but there's also Living We Network with the kind of quite active group that is promoting this idea. Then, well, the natural wetland is a natural wetland, so that is used for a certain purpose, for flood control. And the Bangrakam model, this over-flooded agricultural area, is a larger project by different government agencies. But the universities are already, they also play a large role in consulting government agencies here in Thailand, and they have been quite closely involved also in this project.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. We will take 2 more questions and then we will wrap up to not take up too much of your time and get back to you with the other questions. If we can in a different way, or we'll post them here in the chat afterwards. One interesting question, which is also raised in the guidebook as a topic already, Sylvia, maybe you can say a word on this. My concern on EBA M&E is probably the fact that the impacts and benefits may be realized years after the EBA project ends. So it's difficult for typical end of project evaluation to perceive. Any advice?
Yes, indeed, this is raised in the guidebook as well, because it is a real challenge. So the guidebook provides numerous tips on strategies you can use to enable long-term M&E. Some of these, so they might not be sort of your magic bullet answer, like just get 50 years worth of funding. Good luck on that, obviously. But things like thinking of involving local CSOs, community groups, or so thinking of either local participation, what can you embed, what processes can you embed into local institutions, try to highlight the value of doing the M&E activities for their own benefit. Another thing that we know is happening is working with research institutions and universities that have long-term M&E programs going on. So if you're an individual project, reach out to your local or national universities who might be working in that area. Similarly, look for national or regional M&E efforts. So anything that you can link to potentially wider, longer-term programs is a way to go. Another, if you have a very good relationship with your funder, you can also think of opening a conversation about low-level but sustained funding to maintain M&E activities. And if all of those things fail, then working on a very well-developed theory of change and thinking carefully about your proxy indicators that will be able to, have the best potential to predict future outcomes will be your best bet for starters.
Thanks, Sylvia. That was, I think, very useful. One last question, maybe to both of you, and you sort of already went into that by answering this last question, Sylvia, a little bit. How can you ensure the long-term engagement of local people and stakeholders? And how are you doing that in Thailand, Lisa? And how can you do it more generally, Sylvia? Maybe you can both say a word on this one.
I can start for the Thailand case if you want. So yeah, our idea is obviously that our project is another 1.5 years. So obviously we will not be able to run the full process or for long enough. So that is also why we had this idea of establishing this partnership that should exist beyond our project, and it can also exist kind of without us. So it is led by the ONWR and the lead agency in the water sector, and they are also the ones that in the end will be let me call it, the owner of this methodology, and the ones that then are also in charge of replicating it and communicating it, or putting other agencies or stakeholders on different levels in charge of M&E for EBA's measures. Then obviously the universities will have some expertise. As I already said, they work very closely with government agencies. And what I didn't mention in the presentations is that we are also looking into, or ask the universities to make some suggestions how students could be involved in a kind of regular intervals. So how could this M&E work maybe also be integrated into curriculums? And then last but not least, of course, the communities. Someone also asked how they are involved. The projects haven't started yet, so we don't have the answers to that yet. But just to mention, for example, there are possibilities of, one idea is, or one thing I have in mind is, for example, in the US, there's a little stand where you can put your mobile phone in and take pictures of the forest, and all are at the same place. So that is how to document how the forest that was under fire is regenerating. So just to say, so we are looking for kind of maybe simple, maybe a bit difficult, let's see, options to involve the communities in the gathering of data and in the monitoring. But we don't have a final answer to that yet.
Yeah, I think Lisa has covered many of the aspects, that I already mentioned in my previous response. And I would just like to say that in terms of getting communities involved and local participation, thinking about, what are the arguments in all of this that will make them care? Monitoring and evaluation can sound a bit dry, but actually at the end of the day, M&E is what will allow you to, responsibly and, let's say, as safely as possible, implement projects that are meant to help people deal with climate change impact. So, we can often approach all of this talking about M&E and climate change adaptation and many technical terms, but at the end of the day, what it boils down to is, how people's lives will be impacted and hopefully improved through projects. So if those benefits can be highlighted to them, and even villages will have some form of local organization and community groups, and if you can distribute certain responsibilities of certain types of data collection, and by really emphasizing why having that knowledge or acquiring that knowledge will help them in the future, I think that is the key way of engagement.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Sylvia. I think at this point we should conclude. There are more questions in the chat, which is really great to see. It's overall great to see that there's so much interest in this topic, and we will try to collect the questions and sort them a little bit and see how we can get back to you on them, or how we can make use of the questions for follow-up sessions. So thank you for this. It's not lost if your questions weren't answered right now. With this, I would like to conclude the session. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact me via email. You can see my email in the chat right now, and you can also find it in the invitation to this webinar. The recordings of the webinar will be available online soon on adaptationcommunity.net, and we will also send around the link to the recording as soon as possible. Thank you very much, and we look forward to continuously working with you on the topic of M&E, and we will keep you updated in the future. Have a pleasant day and evening. Bye-bye.